The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. The wind gibbers with their voices, and the earth mutters with their consciousness, but of their semblance can no man know, saving only in the features of those they have begotten on mankind. As a foulness shall ye know them. Their hand is at your throats, yet ye see them not.
Town Horror is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. And it just, every time I reread it, I notice something else. It encompasses so much, and it's remarkably tidy about how it does it. It has, all the things you want from a Lovecraft story. So, eldritch tomes that you're not supposed to access at the library, forbidden texts, and local lore that people just don't talk about. Strange things in the geographical region nearby that nobody can quite explain. And there's a remarkable amount of destruction involved. Things are put together and then they are torn apart.
There is only one existing letter from Lovecraft to Myrta Little. It kind of reads like a desperate attempt to dodge Myrta's only two obvious overtures. Lovecraft is an outspoken atheist and a scientific materialist, going so far as to include in the letter a parody of insipid Sunday school exempla, George's Sacrifice. It was doubly cruel for Myrta, who at least tried to find a religion that she was comfortable with or a faith that fit her best, and she never did quite find it. It is possible that this is not the last time Lovecraft would scribe a grotesque Christian parody to shake Myrta's beliefs.
The Dunwich Horror was an inversion of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Lavinia Watley was an inverted Mary with an inverted Immaculate Conception via the interdimensional deity Yog-Sothoth, and Sentinel Hill was the story's Golgotha, the hill upon which Christ was crucified, and the hill upon which Wilbur Watley's unnameable brother was destroyed.
Writing the story after a week-long stay in central Massachusetts with fellow amateur journalist Edith Miniter, Lovecraft was drawing on the region's colorful folklore, locals, stone sites, and legends, and any further speculation on the story's origins might have stopped there, if not for an empty envelope, discovered at auction, postmarked July 27, 1928, the week he finished the story, and began sending the manuscript to his circle, from Lovecraft to Myrta Little Davies.
Myrta was definitely looking for spirituality, and it gave her sort of a drive. You could call her ambitious, you could just call her focused. She doesn't have to make a living. She was considered to be absolutely the top of the chain of food in Haverhill. Her family included Supreme Court justices, signers of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, you name it. They were the New Hampshire people who direct linear descendants. She shows back up in Hampstead about 1919. She's not working. She apparently is substituting in the school system when absolutely necessary, but she's become a full-time writer. She's writing little poems in Kindergartner magazine. She's writing short stories that are being picked up by syndicates. She is making a living at it, which is something Lovecraft never could say. His poetry is pretty unremarkable. It's classically built, it's elegantly written, but it's unremarkable. Most of it was appearing in a amateur journal put out of Haverhill, Massachusetts by a man named Tryout Smith. Charles W. Tryout Smith, age 69, ran an amateur monthly newspaper, the Tryout, out of a small press in a shed in his Haverhill yard. He had published some of Lovecraft's earliest works, and by 1921, Lovecraft was very keen to meet him in person, as was Myrta. He tells her, I'm going to go tomorrow to visit Tryout Smith, and she invites herself along. And this little adventure is actually in Lovecraft's published works, the collected essays, as the Haverhill Convention.
Of the various shrines renowned in the annals of amateur journalism, none surpasses in importance that which bears the title of Tryout Smith's home on Groveland Street in Haverhill, Massachusetts. It is here that the Tryout is issued faithfully from month to month, and here that Charles W. Tryout Smith presides like a patron deity over an Arcadian domain. Notwithstanding these things, Groveland Street still remains a terra incognita to most amateurs. Now and then, some favored mortal makes the pilgrimage and returns, but the number of such pilgrims is not great. It is therefore scarcely to be wondered at that a pride fills the souls of those who participated in the Haverhill Convention of Thursday, June 9th, 1921.
Tryout would publish a new Lovecraft story the following month, and one wonders if Lovecraft was playfully jabbing Tryout with his fiction, as he often would his circle.
The terrible old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house near the sea. To a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who pays for his necessities with Spanish gold and silver, minted 2 centuries ago. They were really quite sorry for the lonely, unpopular old fellow, but business is business. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the 3 unidentifiable bodies, which the tide washed in. I am conscious of a vastly increased aimlessness and inability to be interested in events, due partly to the fact that much of my former interest in things lay in discussing them with my mother. This bereavement decentralizes existence. My sphere no longer possesses a nucleus. My aunts endeavored to arouse me and insisted that I respond to an invitation to visit an exceedingly learned and brilliant new United member, Miss Myrta Alice Little, a former college professor now starting as a professional author in Hampstead, New Hampshire, near Haverhill, Massachusetts.
During that significant visit, and several more to follow, Lovecraft would learn much that would influence his future writing.
His visit to Tryout Smith gives us Shadow Out of Time. The hero is from Haverhill. He's married a girl with a Haverhill name. The name of the character, Nathaniel Peaslee, is right out of the Pentucket burial ground. The character was born and raised on Boardman Street, which is the big street right next to Tryout Smith. The character is literally Tryout Smith's neighbor.
My name is Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee. The press was filled with the details of my strange amnesia in 1908 to 13, and much was made of the traditions of horror, madness, and witchcraft, which lurk behind the ancient Massachusetts town then and now forming my place of residence. It may be that centuries of dark brooding had given to crumbling, whisper-haunted Arkham a peculiar vulnerability as regards such shadows.
Interestingly enough, old historical maps of Haverhill are very similar to Lovecraft's rough sketch of his fictional city, Arkham, where many of his stories are set, with his fictional Miskatonic River waterfront matching the path of the real Merrimack River through downtown, and Arkham's Saltonstall Street, where several Lovecraft protagonists resided, could easily have been a reference to the Saltonstall Monument in Pentucket Burial Ground, which he would have viewed during his tour with Myrta, let alone nearby Saltonstall Lake and its Winnicott Castle. Another location which Lovecraft found inspiring during his visit. Receiving an invitation to the Hampstead Historical Society, where Myrta had worked as the town historian for decades. Dave learned several other interesting things about Myrta's connection to Lovecraft's 1934 creation. Most importantly, that Myrta's grandfather, Tristram Little, married Betsy Peaslee in 1831, making Myrta herself a Peaslee. Had Lovecraft known? The story's Nathaniel Peaslee falls unconscious while giving a lecture, so similar to the death of Myrta's former Radcliffe mentor, Hugo Munsterberg. Could that have been intentional?
Now, if Myrta Little turns out to be the one who introduces Lovecraft to sacrificial tables, that makes her the godmother of Wilbur Whately. I'm not sure I'd want that on my resume personally, but yeah. But every other story from there on in that mentions stone ruins, you suddenly have to go, wait a minute. Again, you got to get into the author's head because the letters aren't necessarily all-encompassing to give us a clear image of what is real and what is inspired and what is completely made up. That's kind of what fiction is.
Regarding Lovecraft's fiction, Crowley researcher Rick Spence had a hunch that Lovecraft's weird tales might have had touch points with certain wartime scandals in New England, linked to Crowley himself. He recommended we check out a strange spy story in the Mount Monadnock region during the war. An excerpt from Bert Ford's The Dean Murder Mystery, published in 1920. Strange activities on a supposedly peaceful New England farm. The Dean House, mentioned now with awe by the townspeople, can be seen for miles. It is one of the landmarks of the region. The mysterious signals, flashed day and night from the framework of mountains, were not the product of rural imagination or war hysteria. The signals were real. All the evidence shows that nobody, with the exception of those concerned in the traitorous operations, knew more about what was going on than did Dr. Dean.
Mr. and Mrs. Dean were beloved local characters. Everybody liked them. They'd been here for years, and they were just very kindly thought of, which was one of the problems, because nobody could think of a motive why anybody would want to murder Dr. Dean. August 13, 1918, Dr. William K. Dean lived on a farm just a couple of miles away from where we are, hilltop with a beautiful view of Mount Monadnock. He went out to milk his cows at midnight, and he never came back. The next morning, his wife, who was suffering with dementia, reported him missing. Search teams came, they looked, they couldn't find him. Eventually, they found his body in a cistern on the property. He had been strangled, he had been hog-tied and dumped into the cistern. Right away, there were suspects. Sadly, initially, the first suspect was Mrs. Dean herself. Another suspect was a guy named Lawrence Colfelt, who was a tenant who lived in, there were two houses on Mr. Dean's property, and he lived in what was called the summer house there on the property. Charles Rich was supposedly Dean's best friend. He was the banker in town here. Very powerful and well-connected person. And then the final kind of thread or theory was that it had something to do with German spies, because the day before he was murdered, Mr. Dean told an associate that he had important information for the government, and he wanted them to send up somebody to talk to him, and he never got to give that information because he was murdered that night. The Justice Department was involved because there were people seeing lights shining from Mount Monadnock. At the time, President Wilson had told people to be aware, be on the lookout for possible spies. It was a time a little bit like now. People were worried about terrorists. And they sent up some agents here to look and to investigate to see, well, are they seeing lights? What does it really mean? And while they were here, one of the people they had been sent to investigate was this Lawrence Colfelt guy, who some people suspected of being a German spy. He didn't have to work for a living, but he spent money very freely, he and his wife. He had a stepdaughter, his wife's daughter, Natalie, who was a student at Radcliffe, and supposedly that's why they were in the Monadnock region, so they could be close to Boston to visit her. So the Bureau of Investigation's investigation kind of took a 90-degree turn from being looking for the lights that might be German signaling on Monadnock to the murder of William K. Dean.
At the same time as the Dean murder, that summer of 1918, Aleister Crowley, still residing in wartime America, had undertaken yet another magical retirement. This time to an uninhabited remote spot in the middle of the Hudson, some hours north of the city, Esopus Island, staying there 40 days and 40 nights. He was not without visitors. One day, he was summoned to the local train depot.
A tall, distinguished, military-looking man seemed to be eyeing me strangely. He finally made up his mind to speak. "Are you Mr. Crowley?" he said. He learned to his intense amazement that I was myself working for the Department of Justice. He told me of various sinister rumors about spies. Said he, "There are rumors of flashes of light on the west shore at night which suggest signaling. It might mean serious mischief. A spy might easily estimate our numbers, send the news east by a chain of flash signals, and have it wireless to Berlin. I promised to keep watch."
The DOJ had been concerned about a vast spy signal relay from the Hudson Valley to the shores of New England, up the coast of Maine, coordinating attacks on strategic sites, one of which was Black Tom Island, off Manhattan, completely destroyed 2 years earlier in the summer of 1916, in a pre-war attack that has largely been forgotten.
When I was first asked to write about this, my first thought, and I think a lot of people's first thought, when they're told about the possibility of German spies being in New Hampshire, my first thought was, oh, right, the Germans are going to be in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. The more you look into it, the more it becomes not impossible, not implausible. We now know that the Germans were in the United States doing sabotage operations. Count von Bernstorff, who was the ambassador to the United States, had a slush fund of $150 million to do sabotage. That was mostly against military sites and industrial sites and that kind of thing. Now, sabotage is not espionage. But given that they were here doing that, it's not out of the question that they were also here doing espionage in preparation for the United States entering World War I.
The lights made their first appearance in the hills and mountains of New Hampshire as early as the fall of 1916. Count Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff, former German ambassador to the United States, paid 2 visits to Dublin, New Hampshire, which is not more than 8 miles from East Jaffrey, in the fall of 1916, prior to the entry of the United States into the World War. Bernstorff and other prominent Germans held many mysterious conferences in the hotels and inns in that region, and immediately after Bernstorff's visits, the enemy signal lights made their appearance on the peaks of Monadnock, Pack Monadnock and Temple Mountains. It is a matter of record that the late Professor Munsterberg of Harvard was a frequent visitor to that section prior to his death. And at the Ark, a popular mountain inn on the outskirts of Jaffrey, he met other Germans of prominence from Boston and other parts of New England.
We have to remember that before World War I, being German was a little bit like being Irish or being Italian. There was no particular animus against people who were German. That changed with World War I and World War II. And so Count von Bernstorff had friends in Dublin, New Hampshire, not too far away from where we are, and he visited there. And one dear friend was a horsewoman, and so he went horseback riding with her on Mount Monadnock. And he came back a little bit later on, and there's a whole story that I read about in my book about hiring a local guy to go up Monadnock and take pictures of all the surrounding mountains, which looks awfully suspicious if you're looking for people that are, planning espionage operations.
Charles A. Bean of East Jaffrey, an artist, said, "The Germans told me that they had heard I was a photographer and asked if I would do some work for them. I consented. They came for me the next day in an automobile, and we went up on the mountain, as far as the car would carry us. and then climbed to the summit. They asked me to take photographs of the mountain ranges. All they seemed interested in was the outline and the tops of the hills. The next day they called for me again, and this time we were met on the mountain by a third man, whom I heard one of the men call Bernstorff just once during the trip. Later, I saw Bernstorff's picture in the paper and recognized it as the man I had out that day. Within 2 weeks, the lights began to appear on the very shelving I had guided the Germans to.
There is a rumor that there was a spy cave up there, and to this day, if you know where to look and you're careful, you can find this cave that supposedly had equipment in it and shelves where food could be stored. The best information is that it was actually built by Boy Scouts prior to World War I, but that doesn't mean that it could not have been used by spies who were up there and were setting up signal operations. There was a rumor that Lawrence Kohlfeldt, Dr. Dean's tenant, had a wireless device of some kind in the house on Mr. Dean's property.
Charles A. Bean claimed that he visited the Kohlfeldt home while working for Kohlfeldt in March 1918. He said, "I went there to cut a puppy's tail. In the living room, I saw a wooden box with something in it that looked like a keyboard or a wireless outfit.
He didn't know what it was, and he closed it quickly because he was scared of being found out. Later on, the Kohlfeldts moved after they fell out with Mr. Dean shortly before he was murdered, and they moved to Temple, New Hampshire. And when they did, among the things they moved was a 500-pound box that the guys who carried it couldn't believe how heavy it was. The Kohlfeldts said it was a Victrola, a record player, and those guys knew very well that record players do not weigh 500 pounds. So it was never really nailed down what was in that box. I've lived in New England all my life. I've lived all over, but I've been in the Monadnock region for the past about 40 years or so. And you cannot live in the Monadnock region without knowing about the Dean murder. It's an iconic event that at the time it happened, it was right up there with the Lizzie Borden murders. It was written about up and down the seacoast and even internationally in papers in London and overseas. The problem with the Dean murder was that it fell to local, county, and state investigators to investigate it. And they basically didn't do a great job. They pretty quickly settled on Mrs. Dean as the murderer, which at this point everybody knows was just crazy. The poor woman was suffering from dementia. There was absolutely no way that she would have been emotionally or especially physically even capable of carrying out this crime. But the local and county officials seemed to soft pedal it, which led to really a conflict between them and the federal agents who were trying to do their best to get to the bottom of this. And basically it came down to a contest of wills between the state of New Hampshire and the federal government about who had jurisdiction here and who was going to call the shots. And in the end, the problem was that World War I ended, there was armistice, and as far as the federal government was concerned, was it German espionage? It was now a moot point. And so the interest just kind of died there.
In June of 1917, the same month his hopes of joining the war effort were dashed, H.P. Lovecraft would publish a poem. Its full title, On Receiving a Picture of Ye Town of Templeton, in the colony of Massachusetts Bay, with Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire shown in the distance.
Ancient Monadnock, silent pine-girt hill, whose majesty could move a whittier's quill, whose distant brow the humbler pen excites, whose purpled slope the raptured gaze invites. Stand thou, great sentinel, though nations fall, in thee New England triumphs over all.
Great sentinel, indeed. Presumably, it was W. Paul Cook, Lovecraft's lifelong friend from Athol, an inspiration for the Dunwich Horror, that sent the photograph. Cook would publish the poem in his digest, The Vagrant, that same month, when the mysterious signal lights in Jaffrey were at their height. Cook lived not far from Jaffrey, and prior to The Vagrant, he had published the Monadnock Monthly for years. Cook would have been very aware of the circumstances surrounding the Dean murder. How could he resist sharing its lesser-known details with Lovecraft? In 1948, Cook would be laid to rest, buried in an Oddfellows cemetery at the base of Monadnock. Lovecraft's hymn to the Monadnock region would be revisited and turned upside down perhaps, when, a decade later, he would visit Cook and fellow Vermont writers Arthur Goodenough and Vrest Orton, creating from these visits and a recent devastating flood the background for his horrifying tale of cosmic dread, The Whisperer in Darkness.
Blasphemous influences seemed to surround me. Sleep, I decided, would be out of the question. Great God, that whisperer in darkness. Sorcerer, emissary, changeling, outsider. It was shocking to have the foulest of nightmares of secret myth cleared up in concrete terms. The secret behind the Magellanic clouds and globular nebulae, and the black truth veiled by the immemorial allegory of Tau. I was led to believe that the whisperers of these accursed tales must have had discourse with the outer ones, and perhaps had visited other cosmic realms. Poor devil. Perfect to the last subtle detail of microscopic resemblance. To Nyarlathotep, mighty messenger, he shall put on the semblance of men, the waxen mask, and the robe that hides, and come down from the world of seven suns to mock.
Human spies and unwitting locals, working for titanic secretive forces, curious devices in shadowy houses, used to transmit thought and minds between worlds. And of course, the doomed farmer himself, hopelessly attempting to warn civilization of the alien threat in its midst, but failing to do so before his terrible demise. Just 1 week after the Dean murder, on August 21st, 1918, the New York Times reported a Bayer Pharmaceuticals executive was arrested at Lake Winnipesaukee. Bert Ford's Dean murder book describes the case further. Dr. Rudolf Hutz was accused of displaying signal lights from the upper window of his summer home on Pine Island. What could he have been signaling? The highest point visible from Pine Island on the lake, with sightlines to Portland, Maine in the east, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, further south, was Mount Shaw of the Ossipee Range. 2 years prior, at Mount Shaw's base, in the fall of 1916, when the mystery lights first began appearing on Monadnock, there was another shocking murder with morbid similarities. The tragic death of Florence Small in a cottage on the shores of Lake Ossipee.
My grandparents bought a cottage in 1955, and that cottage happened to be the one that was built on top of the Smalls Foundation. And they knew it. So they decided that they wouldn't stay there at night alone. There were a lot of people who came up there and enjoyed the lake. It worked well. Everybody went home at night. Nobody stayed there until my parents stayed there one night. Swore the place was haunted and left at 4 o'clock in the morning. As soon as the sun came up on the lake and they could get their boat out of the lake and get home, they did. And I wanted to find out if there was anything to it. I guess the first thing that you should know is that the day before the 28th of September, 1916, there was a huge line storm that happened. A line storm was a wind, rain-driven storm that toppled a lot of trees, a lot of cellars filled with water. It was a really bad storm. The 28th, on the other hand, was a perfect day. Everybody was pretty much home sleeping, or pretty much. I mean, it was 10 o'clock at night when all of a sudden it was like the house exploded. It didn't seem to be a normal fire. Some people said that it looked like the house was melting. One of the townspeople, he did look through the window and could have sworn he saw a bed on the first floor and a woman tied to it. And he immediately ran around to the side door trying to get in. And he couldn't get in, the door was locked. And so he ran back to see, if the person was moving at all or anything. And she was gone. The bed was gone. Everything was gone. It was like it wasn't there. And it made him question if he saw it at all, and yet he knew he did. And so he did tell the sheriff about that. And the sheriff didn't know what to make of it either.
Florence's husband, Fred, was away for business in Boston that evening, where he was well connected and had a lucrative side business selling insurance.
He had a lot of connections, and that's what Ed Connor, who was the high school principal, they very often would go to Boston to sell insurance together. And it was because Small knew a lot of people there.
Upon learning of the fire, Ed Connor hired a car to drive Fred Small back to Ossipee overnight.
Small had pretty much gotten there just about the time that they were actually able to get into the area of the cottage, that it was safe enough because it wasn't so hot. And they thought everything was gone. But then one person went around to the stairs, to the cellar, and lo and behold, there was water in the cellar. They found that when they started to go down the stairs, that there was stuff in there that hadn't been destroyed in the fire, which they just couldn't believe their good fortune, because it should have been a total loss. They were all just all of the volunteers were looking around trying to find different things, and they were bagging, tagging things. And Ed Connor went to one of the corners of the basement where he saw a mattress, and when he rotated the mattress, Florence's body popped up. It wasn't really a body anymore. It was damaged in a lot of ways from the fire and things. So you had a skull that was sort of a skull. So it was really easy to see that her skull had been hit several times by what they considered either a fireplace poker or maybe a coal slicer. And then they also saw a bullet wound that went from her, I believe it was her left temple, and the bullet was lodged in her right jaw. And they didn't feel that either one of those things had killed her. But then the cord wrapped around her neck, and her eyes were bulging, and her tongue was sticking out, as strangulation, it does to people. So they considered that to be the cause of death, but all of these other things happened as well. They found thermite on the stove that they eventually found in the basement, but it was in the kitchen to begin with. And they found thermite on the bed frame. And they actually, it's a crusty material that welders use because it burns at a very hot temperature. So they would use thermite to weld hulls of boats or subway rails, things like that. It wasn't something that you go to your local hardware store and get. The prosecution, they first looked around the Ossipee area, and then they threw a wide net trying to find any kind of a dealer of thermite who sold some to Frederick Small. They never found any sale to Frederick Small whatsoever. They all knew that in order to pin this on Small, and it's like they had the guy who did it. They had to have an incendiary device, because without it, he had an airtight alibi with the principal of the high school in Boston, 3 hours away from Ossipee when that fire broke out. There was no way that he could have set that fire unless there was an incendiary device. And so what they did was they took all of the things that they had bagged and tagged that day when volunteers were in the cellar pulling different things out. They hired an electrician and said, "Can you build an incendiary device out of any of these items?" The electrician took the clock, some electrical wire, the German silver wire from the brush, and the batteries from different pieces of telephone equipment that he had. So when the alarm hand hit the hour hand, it would complete the circuit.
Although living on the opposite side of the lakes region at the time, around 30 miles from Ossipee. Aleister Crowley makes no mention of the sensational murder. There is, however, this passage in a Simon If tale.
If walked over to the clock, a man-high affair of carved oak worked by weights. He threw open the door. A needle was attached to one of the weights by a piece of soft wax. Below, on the floor of the clock, was a bomb. The touch of the needle would complete an electrical circuit.
The story, The Natural Thing to Do, depicts a German plot to sabotage America's involvement in the war. There was another unusual tangent with the William Dean murder, just as Charles Bean of Jaffrey reported on the Germans. A Fred Bean of Ossipee was aiding the Small case in strangely similar ways.
Fred Bean was a person who, if I was on the defense team, I would have used him as a possible other suspect other than Frederick Small. And the reason for that was that he kept popping up in places that you wouldn't have expected him to pop up. He had no reason to be there. He single-handedly decided that he was going to guard the ruins of the cottage, supposedly to protect it from looters. And while he was there, he heard footsteps, and he saw flashing lights that were about 100 feet away from the ruins of the cottage. And he did tell the authorities about that, and they believed him, but they never really investigated or looked into it. He found the revolver in the basement. It didn't get found right away. Now, it wasn't one of the first things that was found, and you had to, say, the water was murky, and it wasn't easy to find things in that water. So they're probably doing a lot of feeling around, so maybe he was just the lucky one to find the revolver, but yet he was the one who found the revolver. And he was blackout drunk on September 28th that night. He had no recollection of that night whatsoever. The defense lawyers actually did bring up the fact that Fred Bean could be a possible suspect. There were a lot of reasons for that. And they cited them, and then they immediately said, but we don't suggest that Fred Bean did this murder or burned the house. But we're just saying if he had opportunity, there were probably plenty of other people who did too. And I thought that was really weird, because if I was Frederick Small, I'd have told my team, let's go after this guy, because why not? I mean, it would be reasonable doubt. And they never did.
Two crazy beans reporting mysterious strangers and lights. Two murders with morbid similarities. Opposite ends of the war. At the base of two prominent mountain summits. Wireless and explosive devices. Completely foreign to these quiet rural communities. And the possible involvement of German spies.
For years, I heard a story growing up as a kid that this hideous man murdered his wife, and the story went that he put a noose around her neck and strung her up from the rafters in the attic. That was a story that I had heard, which was totally not true. And I just assumed that he murdered his wife. That's what I had been told. But then when I looked at the incendiary device, the fact that there was no basis for the thermit being owned by Frederick Small, the cord that was in the boathouse, that literally anyone could have gone in and gotten that cord from the boathouse. And so there was Fred Bean, who you kind of wondered what he was doing.
Many years later, one of H.P. Lovecraft's final stories, The Thing on the Doorstep, describes the awful fate of its female antagonist. The body of Asenath Waite, wasting away in a basement, bludgeoned to death by her husband. The story describes late-night drives through the woods of the Northeast, perhaps reminiscent of Small's overnight return trip to Ossipee, or even Lawrence Caulfield's mysterious night trips around the Monadnock region. Then there's the story's description of Asenath.
She was taking a special course in medieval metaphysics at Miskatonic. Dark, smallish, and very good-looking, except for over-protuberant eyes. Asenath, it seemed, had posed as a kind of magician at school, and had really seemed able to accomplish some highly baffling marvels.
It's hard to ignore the autobiographical details in the story, with Lovecraft often playfully drawing on the biographies of his friends. If that were the case, who would have been Lovecraft's model for Asenath? The description is very similar to the CV of Crowley's Dolores Cass, Simon If's sidekick and brilliant student of metaphysics at Harvard's Radcliffe College. The names Asenath and her father Ephraim are of course drawn from the Bible, with Asenath sometimes interpreted to mean from her father in a dark play on words. Some researchers think Lovecraft's estranged wife Sonia Green was the unfortunate model here, but we have witnessed this inversion of Bible story before. And with the Waite family's vast and decrepit pedigree on the North Shore of Massachusetts, it's not hard to see another potential target for Lovecraft's Asenath Waite. Ephraim Waite was thought to be inspired by Arthur Edward Waite, a British occultist. But there is this curiosity of yet another more obscure Waite with a strangely similar predicament. Dr. Arthur Warren Waite, guilty of poisoning his in-laws, March of 1916. Waite claimed he was possessed by a man from Egypt who commanded the murders. No less than Aleister Crowley would be quoted commenting on the very dangerous reality of demonic possession and Dr. Waite's condition. Maybe he was speaking from experience. Crowley himself had a first-hand encounter with his own man from Egypt, his holy guardian angel, who had given him the Book of Law while honeymooning in Cairo. Finally, there's this passage.
In mid-September, Derby was away for a week, and some of the decadent college set talked knowingly of the matter, hinting at a meeting with a notorious cult leader, lately expelled from England, who had established headquarters in New York.
Was Lovecraft aware of the mage's so-called exile in America? And if so, had he written about Crowley much earlier, perhaps as his own man from Egypt?
It was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. He spoke much of the sciences, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless. Where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with screams of nightmare, and I saw the world battling against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, and through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of the drums. The gigantic, tenebrous, ultimate gods. The blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep.